Okay, welcome back to Heads and Tails with me, Henry Faber. I'm one of the co-founders at Opperden, and I couldn't be more excited today to be back chatting to my old friend, Professor Dr. Gergraus, OBE nonetheless. I think I have to take you back a little bit of storytelling because I first met Ger several years ago. I was probably 24, just starting out on my educational journey, and I got told to go and see this guy in Westfield Shepherd's Bush. I thought, what on earth am I going to Westfield Shepherd's Bush for? And it was because I was going to meet the first global director of education for Kidzania. And I hope we hear a little bit about Kidzania today because it's a fascinating story. But surrounded by all these tiny children learning to be pilots and doctors and everything else in between, our meeting opened my eyes completely to Kidzania as this fascinating social experiment. And for want of a better phrase, I'm going to explain this badly, a data collection exercise on children and some amazing things about where they're going and what they want to do with their lives. So it's not just a great place to take your kids. I'm not doing publicity for Kidzania, I promise. It's had a lasting impact on me ever since that meeting. I can't possibly explain Ger in a short introduction, but he's originally from the Netherlands. He began his UK teaching career back in the early 80s, and since then has held myriad leadership roles in education, from Manchester City Council to being the founding CEO of the Children's University, which I hope we'll hear about as well. He's an innovation force, a Willy Wonka of the education landscape, an advocate of early careers education, emphasizing that children can only aspire to what they know exists. And I don't think I've met a speaker in the world of education quite like him. I could definitely go on, but I think it's much better we use the time to hear from him directly. Also very excited to hear about his new publication, Through a Different Lens, which I think is going to arrive in his house literally this morning as we record, set to launch this month, April 2025, as we record. So Ger, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you sharing the time.
Thank you for having me. I too was 24. I've just aged much worse than you have, my friend.
You're looking
glorious to be
fantastic
with you.
for it. No, thank you. This is going to be a fun conversation, I can tell. Strap in. Here we go. You know we are crazy about mentors, all things mentoring. I'd love to hear your reflections on mentorship. Did you have a mentor? Do you still have a mentor now? Anything you're happy to share?
The mentor thing is an interesting one, isn't it? Mentors and role models are key and have been key throughout my life. And in that kind of thing of trusted advisors, I think trusted is really important in that thing. And I have too many to mention, because I think for every situation and for every experience, I'll find one. And I think partly that's about mentorship, isn't it? We need to get our young people and people in general in a position whereby they don't wait for us to offer them. They need to come to us and ask for one. Because then you recognize that that really important bit is that if you can't find the solution yourself, you need to know somebody who does. And schooling does that really badly because there are straight lines and 1 and 1 is 2 and we need to find the answers. So I think that issue of role models and mentors and creating the confidence in our young people to go, knock, knock, I need to know something, is really important. There is an issue, and I write about this in the book, about mentors and role models, which with the benefit of hindsight has kind of challenged me a little bit. And that because there is an inbuilt societal assumption that a mentor and a role model has to be very experienced, and by the nature of the beast is therefore older than the mentee. And when I actually look, particularly in the field of technology and what on earth to do with it, I don't think that's true. I think most recently, most of my mentees have been 17, 18, 19-year-olds who are quite brilliant at lots of things, and where I comfortably sit down and go, I have no idea what I'm doing here, but I know that you can give me the guidance and the advice to do these things brilliantly and in a way that they matter. And of course, I have older mentors, from my grandfather to my German teacher to lots of people. But I would urge friends and colleagues to think about mentors and role models not as an age progressive thing, but as something that fills in a gap that you need filling in, and that we need to have the courage to go to younger people and say, you know this much better than I do. Can you give us a hand? And I advocated at my youngest daughter's school not that very long ago, that they should pay 17 and 18-year-olds to teach 8 and 9-year-olds the pros and cons of technologies and TikToks and storytelling, because you know what? They're much better than the teachers had. They're not at the content and they're not at the safeguarding, but in terms of making it happen and making it purposeful, we have lots to learn. So I urge for a broad-minded approach and courage when it comes to mentors and role model, and not to ignore young people just because they're young.
I love that. I think I'm so pleased, partly because two of the things you've advocated there are things deep within the DNA of Oppidum programs. One is that reverse mentoring, or sort of swap seats analogy. We call it swap seats. And the other is the peer mentoring influence of, can you upskill, can you empower a young person in their teenage years to be much more powerful with that younger student and the more relatable figure. But I love the focus on the reverse mentoring piece of that. You know, let's look down, go age, not regressive, that's the wrong word, but I think that's a really nice analogy to give those young people the confidence also that we want to hear what they have to say. I think that's amazing. I'd love to very briefly go back to your childhood and your education, and just a little soupçon of like how that's affected you and the adult that you are today. Maybe there's an anecdote from school that just gives us a little flavor.
I mean, there are lots, like everybody has lots, and there are funny ones and good ones and sad ones and bad ones. And I think one of the important things is that we need to become better, I think, at recognizing what matters and sticking it in our back pocket just in case we need it at some point. And that is the benefit of hindsight. We talk about the benefit of hindsight often in this country as a negative thing. Oh, with the benefit of hindsight, I would have done it differently. Actually, what would you have done the same with the benefit of hindsight? So I look at it as a positive. And invariably, I was thinking about this. And I come back to my primary school, a Roman Catholic primary school in the south of the Netherlands, in a small town called Echt. And with hindsight, I look at it now, and I think it is somewhere the beginning of the distinction between schooling and education. Schooling being a short period of time whereby somebody's decided what we should know, and education which goes on between 0 and 99. And actually, the better schooled we are, the better able we become to educate ourselves. So it sits in there. I was quite a curious kid. I was about 9 or 10 years old. I asked why a lot. So I'm sure I've annoyed people, and nothing's changed. And so religious instruction or Bible studies was conducted by the local priest. I won't mention his name. And it was there was the Old Testament, and it was Adam and Eve. The story. It's a great story, pleasant story. So he tells the story, and he told the story really well because I was engaged. And then he said, "It's Adam and Eve, and got two boys, Cain and Abel, and that's where we all come from." So the boy who asks why puts his hand up and says, "That doesn't sound right." So he removed his belt, and I was chastised for asking inappropriate questions. So the lesson became, don't ask why. Why go to school? Anyway, I was innocent. I swear I was innocent. I wasn't so innocent a couple of years later at secondary school when the same priest came for Bible studies, and this time it was Noah's Ark, which in many ways it's the same story but slightly worse because there's animals involved potentially. And I deliberately asked the question why. And he said, "Not you again." And he started to remove his belt, and I said, "If you touch me, I'll hit you back." So I was probably the first young person to be excluded from religious instruction in a Catholic school, certainly in that Catholic school, and for asking the truth. So I wear that badge with pride. I think it's quite a funny story now. I think there's a very serious thing about it, that if we only want to teach, we need to gag our children. If we want to educate, we need to grow up in that process and become part of that wonderful process of turning on the lights. And what we've got to accept is that if education is about turning on the lights, we can't make it dark again. Hallelujah. So that's my one of the many.
No, they're great.
Anecdotes.
They're great anecdotes, and when you start to tell them, I almost think we're going to hear a sort of three men walked into a bar joke, and then it sort of leans down this serious message.
That's the epiphany one. Three wise men walked into a bar. That's for the next time, right?
Exactly. That's for episode part 2. You've had a very varied career across very different types of setting in and out of schools. Maybe just a brief highlight and a toughest and a highlight. The sort of peaks and troughs of that. Maybe something that you fall back on as those top and bottom
Tough
moments.
one's an interesting one, isn't it? Because we think a lot about tough being wrong. But actually, I can think of many occasions where the decisions were incredibly tough, but were the right decisions for the greater good, and certainly the right decisions for the children in those schools. Where I can think of a school closure when I was senior inspector in Salford. We had to close this school, and we had to reopen it because it was rotten to the core. The tough bit is that at some point at 2 o'clock in the morning, you also realize that the people who may lose their jobs as part of that process, for example, are people who've got families, they've got children themselves, they've got livelihoods. They are not necessarily the main perpetrators. I think the tough bit comes when the personal meets the professional, unless you are incredibly callous and you're one of the people who doesn't care about the personal side, in which case maybe you shouldn't be in education in the first place. But are
you saying almost fallout of leadership decisions, the sort of the ripple effect, the consequential ripple effect that's not
of course, and of course, as a good old Catholic boy, I suffer from A-level guilt, right? So that comes into the mix. So I think that's one side of looking at the tough bit. In writing the book, this kind of professional autobiography, I suppose, there was something else that touched me on this, and that's a hindsight thing again. So the question becomes, the tough question becomes, after 43 years of working in education, so what? So what's the difference, right? And that's a difficult question, particularly if, like me, you've worked almost entirely with the most disadvantaged communities in the country. So in 1999, I was asked to become the director of the 2 education action zones in Wythenshawe in South Manchester, now also known as Marcus Rashford Land, and very disadvantaged communities. And it was one of initially 25. So the Blair government at the time had identified the 25 most deprived, disadvantaged areas in the country and gave them special status and special funding. And we worked really hard, and we used the funding really well, and we had the schools on board, and we had the families on board, and we had the children on board. But in my reflection, 25 years later, in the cold light of day, those 25 areas of 1999 are still the same 25 areas. In fact, the ranking order is pretty much the same also. So on a quiet Sunday morning, you do sit down, quite rightly, and say, so what was it all about then? And in the end, what I end up doing is invariably, I suppose, you focus on the individual. What value did you add to families, to communities, and to children? And maybe you measure that value differently. So you measure what you value as opposed to just value what by test you can measure. But it's a challenging and it's a tough moment to sit down and look in that mirror. And I still quite don't know what the answer is. And I'm still at times uncomfortable with it, because what I do know is, whatever the answer is, I would have hoped for better, and I would have hoped for more. Yeah. And then I suppose linked to that thing about, well, what did work and what was joyous. And it goes, actually, I go back to those Wythenshawe days. And of course, there are many things in your life. German exchanges, work experience for 14-year-olds who went for 6 weeks. You did all those things. But there's one thing we did in 2004 in Wythenshawe. We taught, I introduced languages into all the primary schools. And we worked with embassies and consulates. And we said every school had a partner school in either France, Germany, Italy, or Spain. And even in Russia, there were some in St. Petersburg. We got lots of European funding, and we trained our teachers. And then I kept going back to that why question. We need to enable our children to find their purpose. The question I ask globally of lots of children is, why do you go to school? And the answer in 85% of the cases is, because I have to. It's the saddest answer you could get. So it falls on us not to tell them why, but to create the scenario for them to discover why. So, cut a very long story short, with the help of Neil Morrissey and all sorts of wonderful people, we effectively turned the 12 Shakespeare plays that are set in Italy into 10 minutes each, 5 minutes in Italian and 5 minutes in English. We auditioned 50 children. They had to come to practice and Italian lessons on a Saturday for a year. If they didn't turn up, they were off the project. We lost 3 in that year. And then we went to Italy, to our partner city, which I'd set up in Bologna, in the Piazza Santa Stefano. And they performed those Shakespeare plays live on Italian television in front of 700 people, including the ambassador. Now, this was a big deal because we'd been told by all sorts of people that you can't do this with these kids. And we proved that we could. And parents came by minibus, by train. Grandparents were there. It was a feast of achievement. And the bit that springs to mind was a 10-year-old girl at the time called Samantha Fisher, at the time also known as Juliette Capulet. And we interviewed all the youngsters for a film 4 years later. And we interviewed her. And her answer was the life that Juliette lived in that play. And she had no idea that was her answer was. Because her answer was, our lives will never be the same. And out of all the 40-odd years, and out of all the A-stars and all the wonderful things, if there's one thing I would want to put on a plaque on a wall, it is the recognition that something I was involved in changing the lives of children and their families for better. And I think that's what teaching is about. I think that's what engagement with children is about. It's about hope. It's about peddling hope. And the more disadvantaged the youngsters, the harder we have to peddle.
I think that's a wonderful answer and a wonderful story. Also bringing in this European vibe to it as well, which is there's so much that's wonderful about that. And I love the phrase feast of achievement and peddling hope. I think also a wonderful little phrase to take away. I'm sort of furiously scribbling this down. So from the dizzying heights of that kind of a story, I'd love to take us back into the day-to-day of your life and education now, and perhaps some recommendations of content. We're running a little short on time and I want to get into more things, but perhaps, I'd like to know, are you reading lots? Are you watching? Are you listening? Are you doing all three? How are you getting your content, and what are you happy to share for us that you think is going to change lives and educate?
I think you get your content by keeping your eyes and your ears open, right? And looking around you, and don't stick your nose in a book for too long because you might miss the real world. But I think there are 3 things that I would recommend to folk. If you want to read a book, read The Little Prince. All grown-ups were once children, but only few of them remember it. If you are not one of those few, you shouldn't work with children. If you want to see a film, see Schindler's List. I managed to organize at the time when I was senior inspector in Salford that every teenager in Salford got to see the film for free. Because because it's so important. And then in terms of a podcast, I became in my life friends with the late Desmond Tutu and his family. And I did an interview with his daughter Tandy not long after the great man had passed on. And the series was called Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. And we just talked about him, about his values and principles, about that laugh that he laughed. That if you've never heard Desmond Tutu laugh, Google Desmond Tutu laughs. And I promise you, you will just enjoy it because and he was glorious. And he and I shared vanilla ice cream and fish and chips on his 86th birthday in Cape Town. And the reason I advocate that is because what Desmond Tutu did best was humility and truth. And I think we live in a world at the moment where I sometimes fear that humility and truth are becoming rare commodities. And we as teachers need to be the safeguarders of humility and truth on behalf of our children. The more the politicians lie, the more we need to safeguard.
I love that. An unpopular opinion, we always ask people about this. Is there something you're happy to stand on a soapbox and say, no, this is my opinion, you're going to disagree, or the majority might disagree?
I think Margaret Thatcher once said that one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. And she said that, I think, about Nelson Mandela. So it's an interesting question because what's unpopular with some is not with others, and what's controversial with some is not controversial enough with others. My view about education and schooling in this country is that in this country and in many countries that have modeled themselves on the provision, particularly in England, is I think we've ended up with a system that is unfair, that is unequal, that is deliberately kept so, where the masses are schooled and the elite is educated. There is little or no interest in the individual young person. We have a system that is accountable to the system, whereas we should be accountable to the young people. The analysis of the data and the reporting of the value we add should be to the difference we make to all children. And we've lost that. And essentially what's happened is that compliance has become our aspiration. You get an Ofsted inspection, you are judged outstanding. What does that actually mean? It means that you tick the boxes better than most. Doesn't mean that you're doing right by the youngsters. We have a system whereby the education, particularly at secondary, through quangos like multi-academy trusts, is no longer accountable. It's certainly not democratic. And I think it has, in some instances, reportedly, a disregard for the human rights of our young people. We should hang our heads in shame. And incidentally, and this is a really interesting position, we have in the state system much to learn from the independent sector about trust and about working with young people. That does not mean governments mistake this, that we need to make this all state schools like the independent schools. We are here to serve the children. And in an age when personalization is here, we are still teaching in our secondary state schools, in our large factories, the robotization essentially is as if we're serving the first industrial revolution. There's this wonderful thing that Billy Connolly once described about his school years in Glasgow when the school leaving age was 14. And he basically says, well, I spent time in a secondary school watching pigeons screwing on the roof. And then what happened was the gates of the school opened and the gates to the Clyde shipyard opened and you automatically went through. That world has changed. But our schooling has not. And we have to ask ourselves, genuinely look in the mirror, is what we're doing fit for purpose? And my conclusion is mostly it isn't.
And I love everything you said. I think many will agree and feel that sense of frustration. Where do you see the innovation most likely to come from?
Well, it's an interesting thing. The innovation can only come from teachers and from proper head teachers. I'm not talking about Quango CEOs who sit in an office in a middle-aged white men wearing a tie and a suit who don't really know what their children look like. What we've lost over the years is trust. And we as parents and we as communities need to grab hold of this. I trust the teachers of my children. If I have an issue, I don't shout at them. I don't go on X or Y or Z or Twitter or whatever it's called these days. I go and see them. There needs to be a dialogue, a societal dialogue, what it's all for. And I think one of the mistakes that we're making is that successive governments align schooling success with economics. Actually, educational success is a societal matter. We want decent people. We want people who understand work ethics. We want people who understand values. We want people who understand the importance of the arts and the humanities. We have to come to the point where my children and your children make a better job of this than we do. By perpetuating the status quo, schooling the living daylights out of people, we're not going to achieve that. So we need a societal debate, but the trust is the key element. Trust between teachers and children. Trust between the schools and parents. So knock down those high fences, stop those intercom systems, stop parents' evening. I used to go to parents' evening for 5 minutes with every teacher in a year, and you go, how does that work? And then they tell you what you already know. We really need to have that discussion. And actually, incidentally, a discussion means compromise, consensus, agreement on values. It also means the preparedness to acknowledge that you got it wrong and that you'll get it wrong in the future. So I think we need to grow up, quite frankly.
Go. You've given a lot there. I've broken all my timing rules because we've had to, because this has been such an interesting. Honestly, you're one of those people that anyone interested in education should and must listen to more. And I always enjoy our conversations, and this has been no surprise at all. I think you've answered my final question really in what you've just said. I'd love to give you a parting word though on your book, because I think we're timing this really well with this coming out, and I'd just love to hear a little bit more about what people should expect, and let's see if we can drive a few educators that way.
So the book's called Through a Different Lens. It's got my glasses on the cover, and that's and then lessons from a life in education, and it's genuinely just stories. I think, incidentally, every school should use one of its teacher CPD days to get all the teachers to tell each other stories.
I love that. That's a great practical
right?
thing. Yeah.
And actually, and you could only tell stories using the names of children. I'm not interested in anything else, because that's where the accountability lies. So I was approached by Routledge 4 years ago to write this thing, and my answer was, I hate writing. I'm not doing it. And in the end, we did it together, and with Bruce Roberts and Rebecca Durcroft from Westchester, who helped me and coached me and mentored me through this. And in the end now, I look at it, and it's literally on the doorstep now. The author's copies have just arrived. And now I'm looking forward to reading it. And I was asked the question, well, who is it for? And my answer was proper teachers on their way to the beach.
There you go. Well, for teachers on their way to the beach, we will hope they're listening to it. I mean, reading it. I will be purchasing my copy as of today, and I'm excited to ask you more about the launch and how it all goes. You've been very generous with your time. This is a really, really special episode, actually, for lots of reasons. So thank you. And you're going to have to come back and do more talking for us at some point. I hope that's all right. I think we're going to need a follow-up. We're going to need a follow-up. We need a rest is politics, but the rest is education, led by Ger Grouse. I think that would be great. Thank you so much. Wishing you well and good health and success in the next few months, and all the best for the children we try our best to support too. So thank you, Ger.
Thank you, Henry. I hope to see you soon. And it's, as always, it's been a pleasure. and a privilege.